Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. A woodworking marking gauge is an essential tool for every woodworker, in particular hand tool woodworkers. Knowing how to make a precise line that you can then saw to is critical. I'm going to show you what gauge to buy and how to use it. Stay with me. I'm Rob Cosman and welcome to my shop. We make it our job to help take your woodworking to the next level. If you're new and you haven't subscribed, please do so. Hit the notification bell so you'll receive alerts when we release a new video. And anytime we use a special tool, we'll always leave a description down below. All right, let's get to work. Woodworking is primarily marking lines and sawing or chiseling to those lines, obviously done in a logical pattern, so the end result is something you can actually work with. But when we do that, we're talking about either a pencil line or a knife line. Now, a pencil line has its place, but it's not something that you're going to use for great precision. Here's what I mean. If I need to rip a ½ inch off the edge of this board, I could easily come in here with a pencil, using my finger as a guide, run a line down there, and then saw it. However, when sawing it, and you often heard the expression, do I saw on the line or beside the line, meaning do I run my saw right down through the line or I stay to one side of it? Either way, not a very precise process. However, it has its place. When you start talking precision, so let's say you want to get into a point where you're putting together joints like this right from the saw, perfect fit. That requires a much higher level of precision. If I had struck a line on the end of this board, and now I was going to try to put my chisel to that line, where would I put it? That line actually has width. I could put it on one side or the other or in the middle, not very precise at all. There's two ways of doing this. You can use a knife and a chisel, and a square, and you could go in here holding the square firmly and go in and create a very precise knife line, and there's application for this. Now, your chisel will come along and it sits right in that line. There's no wondering where it needs to be. The problem with doing that is if I had to go all the way around, it's difficult to square a line here, follow it here, around and back, and have it actually line up. A marking gauge, however, you come in here, set your appropriate depth. The head of the tool follows the end of the board, and you get a very precise line. You can go all the way around, and when you come back here, the two are going to meet perfectly. Now when you take your chisel, you simply drag it along until it falls in there, and like I said, there is no guessing where it's supposed to be. There's only one spot for it. That is the advantage of a marking gauge. All right, what I've got in front of me are a pretty good representation of what you're going to get for marking with a knife. Starting here is just a square and a sharp knife. We'll go over that. Then you have a premium marking gauge. You've got an inexpensive marking gauge. You've got the old style pin marking gauge. You have a knife marking gauge, and you've got a panel gauge. So let's look at this one first. I'm going to use a piece of pine, easy material to work. Now, if I had to go all the way around there, whether I'm cutting a mortise and tenon, whether I'm cutting a dovetail, I have to have a baseline so I know where to stop sawing. If I had to do this, I mentioned this earlier, with a square, I actually need one a little bit longer in order to cover that. I obviously have measured my setting, come in with my knife, holding this firmly, make your line, but now you've got to interpret where that is. I would go in and actually put the knife in the cut line, bring the square up to it, cut across the end, do the same thing, put your knife in the line, move the square over to it. See how accurate we are when we get to the other side. And last one. Well, there you go. We missed it by 1/64 of an inch. You know, that would be a game changer if you were cutting a dovetail and ended up with a baseline that was different on one side than the other. So you need it. There are times when you have to use something like this, but it has its limitations. Okay, the next is the premium wheel style marking gauge. I'm going to spend the most time on this because this is what I recommend. And since I make it, of course, there's going to be bias there, but you're going to have to sort through that. Hopefully I can convince you based on how it works. If I had, the advantage here is I've been able to square this up on my shooting board. Now I've got to come in and make a line all the way around. I'm going to show you some of the advantages right now. I had to measure the width of this or the thickness. I simply set it on there like that, let that drop down, and when that hits, because it's flat on the end, I know that that now represents the thickness of this piece. So I prefer to hold this in such a way as to pull it toward me. The shape of the cutter, the bevel's on the inside, it's square on the outside, so as you pull it through the wood, that bevel is going to want the tool to go like that, keeping the end of the tool tight to the end of the board so it doesn't wander away from you. I prefer to pull rather than push, but you can do both. And by the way, the cutter is not supposed to turn. It's fixed. If it turns, it's loose, you're not going to get a very precise line. And one of the big advantages is that when it gets dull, you're only ever using about that much of the cutter at any given time. You can simply just rotate this, and now you've got a new sharp edge. So I hold it like this. I squeeze the knob in between my fingers, just gives me a little more control. And by the way, that little flat spot is just so that it doesn't roll off the bench. Hold it like so, pull it toward me. The other nice thing about a wheel style is that you can roll that last little bit, which gives you lots of control, particularly when it comes to the end where that piece is relatively narrow. Sometimes pulling across like that, you don't have a lot of reference surface because of the thickness of the piece. So simply push against the end and then roll it, and that'll give you a nice precise cut. Pull the inside, roll the final one, and there you go. It lines up perfectly. Gives you a nice fine line, drops your chisel in there, there's no guessing. It's very precise. When it comes to cutting dovetails, I always tell folks this is the second most important tool because this creates part of the finished joint. That baseline of the tails and pins actually is developed with the marking gauge. So that'll have a lot to do with how good your end result is. That is my preferred gauge. All right, the next gauge we're going to look at is this inexpensive wheel gauge. Now, you'll notice the cutter's broken. That's not their fault. I'm sure that happened in shipping. First thing I'm going to check on this is something you might not expect, but that's going to be the face of the head of the tool. If that's not perfectly flat, then you're not going to register properly and it's going to wiggle like this. And I suspect just by looking at it that it's not going to be flat. So if I hold a straight edge up there and look in the light, just as I expected, it's high on either side of this recess and then it slopes down. So the problem with that is when you're using the tool, it's going to wiggle like this and it's constantly going to be recorrecting. That has to be fixed before you can use it. That means you've got to go and flatten that face. Something else you're going to notice right away, as soon as you set it down, it has a tendency to roll, usually off the bench. Now you can correct that by just flattening a spot on there just like I do on mine, and that's the reason why we do it. I also see graduations on here. No big deal. I never use them. I find if you're going to be precise with this, you're going to want to measure the piece exactly, and I find that's the best way to do it. By the way, when I set that on there, it just does not give you that flat feeling, so that would have to be corrected. I also noticed that the rod has quite a bit of slop. I was noticing down here how much bigger the hole is than the rod is in its diameter. So the problem there is you've got your locking point back here, and that's allowing that head to move side to side. That's not going to bode well, particularly in hardwood. And the last thing is it sharp? Typically these don't come very sharp. This one actually feels pretty good. So we'll test it in two things. We'll test it in a piece of hard red oak. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but that's not staying tight. See what I mean? The shape of the cutter should be pulling that tight, but I think it's because the face of that tool is not flat. But that gave me a nice cut line, and if I use it on a piece of northern white cedar, which is very soft and requires an extremely sharp tool, that's a pretty decent line as well. Now, just for comparison, I'll come in and use this one. And if you look real close, I think this one is a little bit finer. And then on a piece of oak, both are decent lines. However, the fact that that head's not flat that's a real game changer. So this would have to be modified. However, as usually is the case, price doesn't always mean that you're getting a great deal. Next one on our list is the traditional pin gauge. This has been around for centuries, and this is always, start again. The next on our list is a pin gauge, and this has been around for centuries, but it's had a common flaw, particularly for new people. You'll notice that when I set this gauge down, I see the cutter where it's engaging the wood. And if I wanted to stop somewhere, for instance, if this was my my 2 lines of 2 pins, and I didn't want to go beyond them, I could simply come in here, move over, and then roll that last little bit so that my line was precisely between the 2 marks. However, if you try to use a pin gauge to do that, as soon as you set that on there, your pin is obscured. Now, I want to show you something real quick. This is exactly how it came out of the box. If I drag that over, you see the mess that makes? What folks don't realize is you've got to go in and completely reshape that pin so that you have a flat side and somewhat of a knife or an oval side over here in order to get that to work through the wood and come out nice and clean. This is just not the best gauge for someone just getting started. If you have the skill to be able to do that, that's fine. The other problem is that that cutter is out so far. When you're using it, you're that far away from the beam, and it just makes it very difficult to control. And something also noticed is that there's a fair bit of slop between the head of the tool and the beam. You see that? Even when that's tight, it still has a tendency to want to move. Not as much, but it still does. And it just has to be precise in order to go in and give you those perfect marks. Comfortable enough in the hand, but I think the biggest downer on this is the cutter itself, the way it arrives, and the fact that you can't see it once you set it on there. Would not be on my list of preferred marking gauges. Our next one is another form of a marking gauge, sometimes called a slitting gauge or a knife gauge. And the difference is, instead of a pin, it's actually a blade. But as it comes, it certainly is not ready to use. You'll see what happens. You run that across a piece of soft cedar, even on a piece of oak, which is going to be a lot more, or a lot less prone to tearing, but still not very comfortable and a bit of a mess. Now, part of the reason as you look at that, you can't see because it's small, but that if I was going to work with this, I would actually go in there and I would reshape that blade. The point on that blade is way, that bevel needs to be brought back more like that. In fact, I would probably even round it a little bit, and you can do some work on that, flatten and polish the front of that so it works just exactly like a knife, but that's not ready to go. Remember, when you do this, you want the bevel on the inside between the head of the tool. That's not high up on my list. I find it a little bit awkward in the hand, and the same problem that you have with the regular pin style is that as soon as you put that down, you can no longer see the cutter, so you don't have that level of precision. Keep coming back to this. You don't have that level of precision of being able to see exactly where the blade meets the wood, and it allows you to get a lot more precise. All right, one left. Now the last one really isn't a marking gauge. It's called a panel gauge, but it works the same way. And what this is, it allows you to reach much farther out. So if I wanted to rip this board, and I want to do it precisely, I would come in with a rule, and I would measure from the inside of the rabbet right here to the cutter, let's say 6.5, and then I would lock my wedge, and then you can come in there, and because you've got so much surface area here, which if you tried to do this with a normal marking gauge, now you have very little reference surface out here compared to how far away the cutter is, and it's going to have a tendency to want to twist on you. You can use two hands and get by, but not very convenient. However, with this, and by the way, this one has the wheel style cutter, you can just, referencing off of that far edge, drag that along, and it'll give you a very precise line, whether you're doing it parallel to the grain or whether you're doing it across the grain. Either way, much easier to use. That's a traditional panel gauge. Back on this end, you have room for a pencil, so that if you're just roughing the board out, you can put your pencil in there, tighten it up into place. I usually switch the head around so that the rabbet is facing that side. But it's just a great tool. If you plan to do any amount of hand woodwork, panel gauge is a pretty critical instrument to have. In addition to the obvious uses of a marking gauge that you've already witnessed me use or do, I'm going to show you a few others that I've picked up along the way that I think make it a really versatile tool to the point where I have several marking gauges. The first one that I can think of is when you're doing a half-blind dovetail. In case you're not sure, a half-blind dovetail is what you typically find at the front of a drawer, and it's called half-blind because you only see one side of it. So when it's together, you see this, you don't see that from the front. However, these back walls, or this thing we call the end lap, if that surface is not square to the face or parallel to this side, if you want to say it that way, if it's allowed to slope forward any, when you put your joint together, it kicks it apart and you end up with a gap on the back. So what I do is, and while I'm doing it, this is all done during the process, I'll take my marking gauge, set it for the depth of the gauge line that I already made, and come in here and just go up and down to make sure that there is no material or there's nothing sticking out beyond that's going to cause that joint to kick apart. And if you've got a large diameter cutter, you can actually reach almost into those corners. I'll always come back as a last final check and just go right into those corners to make sure. But that's really valuable when it comes to half blinds. Something else, if you're doing a lot of mortise and tenon work, and I'm not a proponent of getting the bottom of the mortise super clean. I don't think it has any value whatsoever because it's touching the end grain of the tenon. However, sometimes there's a bump in there that you need to get rid of, and it's difficult to get out with your mortise chisel. So I have several different cutters, and this is really nice because it makes it easy to switch them out. So I want a smaller diameter cutter, so what I'll do is I'll just take that cutter out and replace it with this one, which happens to have a 3/8 cutter. Set that in there. Determine the depth that I want. I would usually do that with a rule. So again, you're just measuring from the head of the tool to the cutter. And then you can tighten it up, set that down inside your mortise, and go forward and back to make sure, or get rid of any bump that you might have in there. Works really well. Now, last place that I often use this, if you're working something where you have a rabbet or a rebate along an edge like that, you can come in with your marking gauge. If you don't have a router plane, you can come in with your marking gauge, set it for the depth that it should be, and then you can simply, referencing off of this side, just run it the whole length to make sure that there are no bumps. And if you cut these with a table saw, sometimes it ends up being a little wavy, but that'll allow you to get right into the corner and make sure that that surface is exactly where you want, so when you put it together you don't have any gaps. Marking gauges. I think it's one of the most critical tools on a hand tool woodworker's bench. Hi, if you like my work, if you like my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos to help take your woodworking to the next level. And I've always said better tools make it a whole lot easier. If you click on the icon with the plane and the chisel, it'll take you to our website, introduce you to all of our tools, and also talk to you about our online and in-person workshops. Good luck in your woodwork.